Good day, all. It's Unique History Channel, and today we'll be doing a reading from African Slavery by Edwin Hoyt. And we'll be reading Chapter 4, The American Slave Trade. Before 1700, there were slaves in every American colony, although in the area above the Chesapeake Bay, the slaves were usually household servants of the rich. In 1700, there were even 1,000 blacks in New England, and in 715 it was reported that there were 2,000 blacks in Boston alone. The slave trade brought more Africans each year, and when the first American census was taken in 1790, the slave population was shown to be 697,000 of a total population of 3 million, or 18% African. In the 18th century, slave trading took hold in New England, with the development of what was called the triangular trade, in which turn depended on the economic relations of England and her colonies. Sugar was grown in the West Indies, and the New Englanders discovered they had the resources and the ability to make sugar into rum. Sea captains then set out with rum to trade, but who would buy the rum? The African chiefs of West Africa would buy great quantities of rum and pay for it in slaves. The planters of the Indies wanted slaves, so the New England slave ship captains sold their rum to West Africans, bought slaves, and took them to the West Indies, where they were paid in sugar and molasses, which New England distilleries made into rum. The central port for slave traders was Newport, Rhode Island. Newport was the home of Captain David Lindsay, one of the most notorious Yankee slave traders of the 18th century. By the middle of the century, Lindsay owned and commanded the brigantine Sanderson, a 40-ton ship and about 10 years old. Indeed, after the first years of the slave trade, buying and selling of slaves tended to fall in the hands of such captains who would risk for much a profit. In these years, of course, slave trading was perfectly legitimate business in American England. The dangers were disease, piracy, and possibly capture by enemies. In 1752, Lindsay decided he would sell the Sanderson and buy a bigger vessel for the slave trade. He found no immediate takers for the Sanderson, so he sailed there once again to the West Indies for cargo of molasses. Then Lindsay made still another voyage, this time to Africa. Early in 1753, the ship was off the African coast, trading rum, old muskets, and cloth for slaves. Captain Lindsay was encountering the major difficulty of the trade, sickness. His first and second mates and 3 men of the crew were probably sick and confined to their quarters. They probably had malaria, which was prevalent along the African coast in those days. Lindsay was a daring man, but he was growing restless. In a letter home, he complained that he still had 13 or 14 hogsheads of rum to trade, but that the trade was going so slowly he was nearly frantic. His anchor cable was worn through, and he had been forced to buy another. He was worried about his ship and did not believe she would hold up much longer, for he could see daylight around her bow beneath the deck, which meant the timbers were separating. The captain finally set sail from the Guinea coast with 56 slaves abroad and managed to reach Barbados safely. The voyage took him 10 weeks, of which 22 days were rainy and stormy, so rough that the wind beat his sails to pieces, and several times they had to be taken down for mending. Of the 56 slaves, he only lost one girl on the voyage, and he boasted the others had arrived healthy and fat. None of the captains of the slave trade were as fortunate or perhaps as thoughtful as Captain Lindsay. However, Captain Collingwood of the Zong threw a cargo of 130 slaves overboard because they were diseased, and he figured that he could make a profit by collecting the insurance, then selling the unfit slaves in the western colonies. Yes, the slave trade was extremely profitable, as the career of Captain William Boats shows. Boats was around a few hours after his birth, drifting in a boat in the Liverpool harbor. He was raised in an orphanage, and while still a boy was apprenticed to a shipmaker. He went from the job of a cabin boy to that of a seaman, and in a few years he managed to become a captain of his own ship. In January 1758, he was the captain of the Knight, which sailed from the Guinea coast with 398 slaves aboard. 6 weeks after, he landed at Jamaica and unloaded 360 slaves. Then off to the Leeward Islands, his ship was attacked by a French privateer, which attempted to sink the Knight. When that attempt failed, the French tried to board the English ship, but the captain and boats and his men drove the Frenchmen off in a fierce battle. After many such adventures, in which he acquired the nickname Billy among the sailors, Boats saved enough money to give up the slave trade and become a banker. Then he sent slave ships to sea, dozens of them, and reaped the profits of the trade, and he died in England a very wealthy man. As such men in England and the West Indies grew rich in trading human flesh, the Americans were not far behind. But there was a difference. The slaves came to the West Indies and the Americas and became part of the culture. Slavery was more profitable in the American colonies, but because the colonial government taxed slaveholders on the basis of number of slaves that they owned. Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island all secured money by taxing slave owners for revenue. Only New Jersey among the colonies taxed slavery in order to destroy the practice. Other colonials say New Jersey did this to protect the importation of white indentured servants. Pennsylvania, peopled by Quakers, was opposed to slavery in principle, was the first colony to take real prohibited tax of the 20 English pounds per head on slaves. Shortly before the American Revolution, North Carolina placed a 40-pound tax on imported slaves because the number of blacks in the colony had grown so large that many were afraid of a slave uprising. From time to time, these taxes were raised or lowered, but gradually it became apparent that slavery was acceptable to the majority of whites, particularly in the southern colonies. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, slavery was legal in all 13 original colonies. After the Revolution, the states drew up their constitutions, and in the 1780s, the northern states began to outlaw slavery, as well as the slave trade. By 1800, the conflict between North and South over slavery had become a serious national problem. One of the causes of this growing conflict was the invention, the cotton gin, perfected by Eli Whitney in 1793. Before the cotton gin in 1792, southern states had exported 138,000 pounds of cotton. In 1800, after the gin came into general use in the South, the cotton states exported 17 million pounds of cotton. The gin cleaned the cotton of seeds and leaves, but someone still had to pick the cotton balls. The planters used slaves even more for cheap labor. Particularly in the North, there was much agitation against the continuation of the slave trade, and actually, it had been outlawed. Most states up north had outlawed the trade by 1800. Slave importation was legal only in Georgia and South Carolina. The New England states, where most of the slave traders lived, had forbidden their citizens to engage in the slave trade. But the laws were constantly flouted, and number of American slave traders on the coast of Africa increased every year. The demand for slaves grew so that after 1800, that Charleston, South Carolina, was the leading slave port in America, and one of the most important slave ports in the world. Between 1804 and 1807, more than 200 ships landed slave cargoes in that city, and in the year 1807 alone, more than 15,000 slaves were landed there. In 1808, Congress abolished slave trade all in the United States, but that did not mean very much. Illegal slave trading continued and flourished until President Jefferson stopped all American ships from sailing for Europe with his embargo of 1807 and 1808. Jefferson's embargo was levied because of a general quarrel with England over shipping rights, tariffs, and the impressment of American seamen into the British Navy. These issues had little to do with the slave trade directly, but the embargo slowed the trade. The War of 1812 put an end to almost all foreign trade, but was not to the slave trade. Spanish ships could easily sail from Cuba to the ports of the South, and if necessary conceal themselves along the rivers. The end of the War of 1812 found Savannah, Georgia, and New Orleans, Louisiana, becoming the most important American slaving ports.